Hey guys, welcome back. So for this one, we are getting into the conclusion of Extreme Venomverse, and I am excited because we are finally returning to Earth 21619 to continue the story of Spider-Man Spider Shadow. And that's not all, because there's a number of other alternate Earths that we gotta jump through. And we're gonna wrap it all up in this one, so next we can get into Death of the Venomverse. And with that said, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top to get all notifications so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so for this first world that we traveled to, Earth TRN 1063, we're only given the title Bloom of Doom, which quickly gives us this short story with no written context, no monologue, no narration, just the visuals, with it really just serving the purpose of showing us more of what's happening around the Venomverse. But long story short, or short story even shorter, we're shown symbiote material falling from space, landing on this unnamed world, which is a mixture of fantasy and what looks to be a version of normal reality, because on one hand, when the symbiote lands on some flowers, a fairy goes to check it out, only to get eaten by this flower venom after getting way too close, which is then followed by the symbiote growing and consuming more as its living darkness takes over what was once a beautiful forest in this world. And from how this is done, as this venom symbiote grows and spreads, it consumes what was once the nature of this land, killing the other fairies and eventually spreading across this planet to other areas where you would have what would seem to be normal people in a normal city getting rained on by this symbiote, which is how it spreads itself out to the rest of this world. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty dark, pretty twisted, and it almost feels like this particular portion of the Venomverse anthology was kinda going for a love, death, and robots kind of vibe, cause if Extreme Venomverse was delivered like that TV show, this would be one of the shortest and creepiest portions that we'd probably see, with no words, just music and visuals. And after this, the next Earth we head over to, Earth 90214, the home universe of Spider-Man New War. We arrive in May of 1941, where here we find Eddie Brock is a minister who's been spending the church's tithes on alcohol and gambling. So eventually he's confronted by Mr. John D. Ward, who tells Father Eddie that he needs to pay up or he's gonna let it be known that Father Eddie's a terrible blackjack player. But with how this goes, John D. Ward, which is pretty much Edward if you switch the D and the E, he gives Father Eddie some extra time so they can talk about it later. So Father Eddie gets on his knees praying for forgiveness and help. So he reads a scripture that says, "In the teeth of the beast will I send upon them with the venom of crawling things of the dust," which he doesn't understand one bit. And I don't blame him. He might have got that Bible off of Wish.com, who knows. But later on while he's at the church, he hears a dripping sound, so he goes to check it out, only for this mysterious drip to turn out to be a symbiote that immediately bonds with him. And going forward, the two of them, they do take on the Venom moniker, with Father Eddie more or less just taking the name from the scripture, but with them going forward on their mission, so to speak, a new name would be given to them by the public, and it's a name that they would be referred to by most on this world. Because going forward, we see this take shape first when they pay a visit to John D. Ward, who's the same guy that came by the church trying to collect from Father Eddie. And it's kind of messed up how this happens, because at first John's trying to talk to Eddie, telling him how, we go way back, because for some time prior to this, these guys were friends. But now Eddie just lets him know that there's a new we now. We are a servant of God, and our name isn't Eddie, it's Venom. And right after that, they eat poor Johnny. And the next morning, Father Eddie believes that this whole thing was just a dream until he hears the news on the radio about what happened, with the media saying that half of John D. Ward's body was eaten by a creature called the Sin Eater that carved the word sinner on John's chest. And this is just followed by the symbiote confirming to Eddie that it's all true, with it telling him that it really happened. It had to be done. It was regrettable, of course. The deaths of the innocent are always regrettable, but the innocent must sometimes be sacrificed for the greater good. Fear not, Eddie Brock, for I am with you. We are one. And later that same day, Father Eddie is paid a visit by Detective Stan Carter from the NYPD, because the detective heard that not too long ago, Eddie and John were seen stumbling out of the tavern with no name. So the detective asked Father Eddie about him even being there, because it's not exactly, kind of place you'd find a man of the cloth. So Eddie responds like, "Did not the Lord himself walk amongst sinners?" Which then has the detective like, "Sinners? Red flag." But he doesn't pry too much further. He just asks Father Eddie if he has any information that he think might be helpful, like if John shared anything useful, if he had any enemies. only for Father Eddie to tell him no. John was quiet and reserved, but if he thinks of anything, he'll be sure to get back to him. And after this, when Father Eddie is paid a visit by a young man named Emil Gregg, who comes by the church for a confession while also going on about the news he heard about the Sin Eater, saying that he's been hearing voices, and as it turns out, Father Eddie's using this guy as a setup, because he tells Emil Gregg that they'll have a personal session at his home later. But before Father Eddie heads over there, he calls Detective Carter, telling him that he's gotta break his oath of silence to tell him about Emil Gregg. So he makes sure to show up at Emil's home first, before the detective, to give Emil this whole speech about sharing his power, only to get Emil to use the symbiote briefly, to jump out the window and make a whole scene, so Detective Carter would believe that Emil was the Sin Eater this whole time. And it's messed up because you can tell that Emil had some issues from the beginning, because it's those issues that are still there even after the symbiote leaves Emil, which have him echoing the voices that he heard, voices that more recently came from the symbiote, now compelling him to confess to the murder of John Deward. And it causes the story that Father Eddie told Detective Carter over the phone to check out completely, with him now having the symbiote back and Detective Carter none the wiser. And after this, we then head over to Earth TRN 1064, where we find the young schoolgirl Ellie Ellison, who on the surface seems like your regular high school kid, which for the most part she is, except for the fact that her hair bow is a symbiote, which at the first sight of danger allows her to transform into this world's lethal protector, Necroco. And there's really not much more to this one. She's got a crush on one of her classmates, Parker Piper, who later gets bit by a radioactive spider, and it's teased that they're gonna team up. And on another Earth, we got Kate Bishop along with Jeff the Land Shark, who has the Venom symbiote on this Earth, so the two of them go for a bit of a wacky adventure, which really just takes them from playing in the park to going to a concert. And after this, on the next Earth, we get a story called Field of Screams. And for this story, I'm kinda split down the middle with it, cause in this world, you got Ed Brock, sports reporter, who's investigating the murder of his cousin Richie, who was mysteriously killed while working at the stadium as one of the grounds crew. So Ed snoops around only to find out that the whole team been juicing and shooting up on some kind of phage drug. So he ends up taking them down. But when it went on to tell the backstory of how a meteor struck in his backyard when he was 18, so he went to check it out, and turns out it was a symbiote, and he used it to become Major League Venom. And I was just kind of like, I guess. Cause I totally understand. Anytime we do the whole Venomverse song and dance, we're gonna get some wacky characters. And it's almost guaranteed to be a mixed bag, which is fine. Cause most of the time when we see something in Venomverse, chances are we're not gonna see much of it again. That is, if the history is anything to go by. But also, it's kind of the point of this for the writers to have fun and just make one of the most ridiculous Venoms you can think of. And that is precisely what Major League Venom is. But after he's done taking down the whole team, he's met by Agent Venom and Wang, who invites him to the biggest fight he'll ever see. And after this, these last two that we get for Extreme Venomverse, bringing this event to a close. Both of these stories, for me, fall under the I would have liked to have seen more category. Because in this world, Earth TRN 1066, we land in what is pretty much a symbiote version of Pacific Rim, where in this case the mechs are single piloted, so that's different. But aside from that, it's the same concept. Cause jumping in, we're shown this world 20 years after First Contact, where a seasoned mech pilot Flash Thompson is dropped into the fight as the last line of defense against these two symbiote kaiju. And with how this goes, he takes down the first one rather quickly, only to find out that the second one is just way tougher. And I gotta say, looking at this, it isn't so much that I'd like to see a drawn out event, 6 issues plus or whatever, but I do believe perhaps a season or 2 of an anime production would do this story a lot of justice. But through the course of this, after Flash eventually defeats this second symbiote kaiju, his mech is totally wrecked, so he has to wait for someone to come pick him up. But during the time that he's waiting, we get to learn a bit more about this Earth's Flash Thompson, who again is much older and seasoned. On this Earth, he only lost 1 leg instead of 2, and he keeps this old picture of himself and Peter Parker that he talks to every now and then, since this Peter died many years ago. And right there, from seeing that, I just assumed that the Peter Parker of this world had an influence on Flash, similar to 616 Spider-Man's influence on the main universe Flash Thompson. And I think something like that just really works for a story like this. And when this ride eventually gets there, we get a glimpse at both Gwen Stacy and Miles Morales in their mechs, which again leaves me just wanting more. And now for the last story. We return to Earth 21619. which is one that a few of you guys might be familiar with if you tuned in for my coverage on Chip Zdarsky's Spider-Man Spider Shadow, which was a top-tier horror story about Peter Parker keeping the symbiote and committing all sorts of Spider-Manslaughter. And in case you missed it, I got a link in the description where you can get caught up on the big spill when I talked about the series from start to finish. But it's here in Extreme Venomverse where we pick up from the epilogue, where we saw that the Kingpin survived his brutal attack from symbiote Spider-Man, because at the time it took a few attempts from Wesley and the scientists to share with Fisk their most recent discovery, because he was so obsessed and enraged about Peter walking away from everything that happened without any consequence, and more or less continuing his role as a hero as if none of this had ever happened. Because if you guys remember, not long after Peter had finally been separated from the symbiote, it took over Reed for a brief while, and it ended up killing him before everything was over, which later took us into Peter's trial, where he was eventually found not guilty, to where then later we got a moment of reconciliation between him and Sue that led to Peter joining the Fantastic Four of this universe. Which again, it's all of these things put together that infuriated the Kingpin, because not only did he see it as Peter doing these things and getting away with it scot-free, but also the Kingpin saw this as a huge sign of disrespect, with Peter Parker continuing to operate in his city. But when Wesley and the scientists show the Kingpin their air quotes discovery, which is a solution to him getting better and destroying Peter Parker, we now discover that this symbiote is indeed the same symbiote, which at the time when we got this cliffhanger, it was kind of hard to tell, because when the symbiote took hold of Reed Richards, it started rolling out a ton of other symbiotes, so it was kind of hard to say if this was the same one or one of the others that it introduced. And on top of that, this story's being picked up by writer Jason Lowe, so it's one of those cases where once the baton is passed, the next writer is building that universe. But as we come back, some time has passed. Peter and the Fantastic Four have fought off the Skrulls together, they fought Galactus, they fought Doom, and this whole time the Kingpin is just as disgusted with Parker as he was in Spider's Shadow. But also since then, his scientists have been working on the procedure to bond him with the symbiote, and Fisk has been working on a plan to separate Peter from the other members of the Fantastic Four so that when he's ready, he can perform an isolated attack, which from here now takes us forward a month at Midtown Hospital, where a fundraiser is being held to support new technology that Peter's donated, which originally was designed by the late Reed Richards, though modified by Peter to make it more user-friendly for both the staff and the patients. But when Peter steps away to visit some of the kids downstairs at the hospital, Congressman Esposito tells Peter that he probably shouldn't swing down there because he might scare some of the older patients, so Peter takes the elevator instead. But as soon as he gets in, his spider sense goes off, with the elevator sending him to an empty floor, and when he steps out, he hears the voice of the Kingpin from down the hallway, telling him how he blackmailed Congressman Esposito to get him to put on that convincing performance, with Fisk having quite a bit of dirt on the guy. And off the rip, Peter's not only surprised to see the Kingpin, but he's also impressed, because he's just like, man, you found a really good plastic surgeon. Because you know, the last time they met, Peter pushed his Fisk all the way back. And as it turns out, the Kingpin was able to distract the other members of the Fantastic Four by getting his scientists to send out a distress signal in the negative zone to keep them occupied, leaving Peter here all alone. So Peter lets Fisk know he was a different person back then. He was completely out of control when he wore the symbiote, and he didn't know his strength most of the time. But the way he sees it, if Fisk wants to go toe-to-toe, Peter tells him that he doesn't need the symbiote to give him two black eyes, only for Fisk to tell him that the shoe's on the other foot now, as he reveals that he now has the Venom symbiote. And going forward, the name is now Kingpin. And as you would imagine, Peter is just completely shocked. He thought the symbiote was completely destroyed in that blast, every ounce of it, only to find out now that it survived and it's bonded to Kingpin. So yeah, he's cracking jokes, but Peter's looking for the nearest exit, because he knows how lethal he was with the symbiote, so he can imagine just how lethal the Kingpin's gonna be, or the Kingpin. That name tickles me. But with Peter trying to make his escape, it isn't long before he realizes that Fisk thought this through thoroughly, because all exits are blocked on this floor, which then forces Peter to turn around and try to fight/reason with Fisk, since his first option's a no-go, and it isn't long before the symbiote cuts Peter, drawing first blood. So Peter cranks it up a bit, going after Fisk, sticking and moving, trying different angles, but the Kingpin doesn't budge. And eventually, after getting tired of just standing there, Fisk grabs Peter's arm, slams him into the ground, and palms Peter's head while telling him, "This is where you die, Parker." And while he's squeezing Peter's head tighter and tighter, eventually, a red scythe comes through his back. As a voice comes through the vent saying, "Ooh, caught me a big meaty juicy one." And man, let me tell you, Peter's like, "Oh, didn't know there was a red one. Let me go check on my teammates." And he's out of there like, he don't need to see nothing else. That man gone. But it's here now where the Carnage from Earth 616 has made its way to this universe for its Venom symbiote. And for Fisk, who's caught up in the moment, he's like, "I almost had him. You let him get away." Only for Carnage to tell him, "Man, you took your sweet time," as he lets Fisk know that he's here for him. And Carnage just one-shots him, only to then absorb the symbiote from Spider's shadow, which now ends Extreme Venomverse, taking us into Death of the Venomverse. But as Carnage walks away, he says something rather interesting and a little scary, because he tells Fisk, "Every fiber of you feels dense. A shame it didn't save you from a good old-fashioned impaling. But don't worry, maybe when this is all over, I'll switch to destroying all the Spider-Men." Which right there is kind of like, wait, what? And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here, who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below where you can go to patreon.com/Dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.